Hello, I'm Devin Wiersma, and thanks for listening to my talk on how to use graffiti effectively in virtual worlds. This is a talk that I have upcoming. I'm going to be presenting shortly to a studio, but I wanted to record it for posterity and to give everybody else this information as well. So thanks for watching. Let's get into it. Who am I? I'm a level designer at the Beans team, working with Devolver Digital on a secret project. Previously, I worked at Ubisoft Toronto on Far Cry 6 and Coco Cucumber on a game called River Bond. I also developed my own games on the side for fun. I worked on a game called Bombing a Graffiti Sandbox, which lets you paint whatever you want in a space. And I also have made a bunch of other stuff on the side too. I also practice graffiti as a hobby. This is some of my work down there in the corner. So why should you, as a game developer, care about graffiti? Primarily because graffiti is a tool for environmental storytelling. Using it properly can promote believability and a player's connection to the world, but there is a lot of nuance to graffiti as a form of art that can lead it to easily being misused and misplaced. So I'm going to walk you through some of the more important nuances of the form to achieve clarity and hopefully help you develop worlds with more accurate and intentional graffiti usage. So why should whatever your discipline is care about graffiti? For level designers and level artists, as I mentioned, it's an ingredient for player leading and world building. It generates visual interest and contributes to the story of environments, how the space has been used, who has been using it, where, when, why. For graphic designers, branding teams, and artists, urban worlds will, or at least should, have graffiti in them, and you're probably going to have to help make it. So knowing these considerations will only help you make more impactful pieces for use in the world. I do think that if you're making an environment that has graffiti in it in any form, it doesn't hurt to know something about it, just so that you can use it more effectively. And plus it makes everything look pretty, and that's nice. So disclaimer, graffiti originates from African American hip hop culture, which I don't have much experience with. I'm a white guy from a small town. I do have experience with aerosol pieces, though my specialization is sticker slaps and not traditional lettering. Graffiti is also a very diverse art form, as you can tell. None of this is absolute truth, but it's just informed by my own personal experiences with the craft. Everybody will have a different sort of story and opinion on it. So, let's get into it. Graffiti 101. Before we start off, I'm going to give you a very quick rundown, a simple overview of graffiti as a form of art, and just to clear up some initial misconceptions some people have. So, there's a lot of conflict between the terms street art and graffiti. Typically, when people say street art, they mean a blanket term for public works that people typically use. Usually it means art that people in power in society deem acceptable, whereas graffiti is street art, but it's stigmatized by society and systemic oppression into criminality. So typically when people say street art, they don't always mean graffiti. They usually just mean a very sanitized brand of art that is seen in public forum. In the eyes of society, these two images in the bottom right-hand corner, they're basically the same thing. What I'm going to be talking about is graffiti specifically because it's not sanctioned by those in power. I'm not going to go into the finer detail of the culture of graffiti because honestly we could be here all day. But it's important to know this distinction, especially because some artists dislike their work being called street art due to its association with sanitized and oppressive systems. It's a very diverse spectrum, but it's worth remembering that it's a malleable term and typically just means something that people in power don't like. And it's also worth remembering that graffiti isn't exclusively aesthetic in nature. It can also just be something someone wrote, kind of like Brouhaha Rocks, which is one that I've seen here locally in Toronto. It's very interesting. Graffiti art comes in a variety of mediums, and each medium has its own sort of nuances and things to keep in mind. A brief overview, so there's traditional aerosol, spray paint cans, as you expect, what most people think of when they think graffiti. You have paint rollers, which offer an artist more coverage and a little less flexibility it's less portable typically with paint rollers, so it's harder to get places with it. Markers allow more flexibility with less coverage. So use typically for smaller tags that you'll see in areas just to get a tag up onto a surface without necessarily doing anything super in depth. Wheat pastes are used with printed messages, typically to mass send a message. You'll see people for putting advertisements out for like political causes or events. Typically they're going to be using wheat paste because it's easy to print stuff beforehand and just paste it up somewhere. Sticker slaps, portable, small, and pre-made, so they have the advantage of getting a mark or a tag up somewhere while being able to prep all of it beforehand, similar to wheat paste. And it's the same with stencils as well. You have the advantage of making a really detailed piece without necessarily having to worry about applying it at the time. You can just kind of put a stencil down and cover it up. And fire extinguishers. Not super commonplace, but I always like to include them because I just think they're neat. You know, they have low control, huge coverage, just maximum carnage. You're basically filling a fire extinguisher with paint and saying, all right, let's go. So I like to honorable mention that one. So I'm going to walk us through some things that as developers we should try to keep in mind as we place graffiti in the world. I'll talk a little about some of the fundamental principles, and then we'll take a closer look at some of the examples just to illustrate what I'm talking about. So obviously location matters. In graffiti, the context of where it's placed is paramount to its creation. An artist chooses a location for a piece to meet their goals and their audience. So before placing graffiti, put yourself in the shoes of an artist and ask yourself, does this location make sense for this message that this artist was trying to say? Like, why did this artist put this piece specifically here? Some other considerations you might want to ask yourself are, who was the artist? You know, what was their motivation? Who was the audience? Who are they trying to send a message to? Who are they talking to? Typically, we don't just put graffiti down where no one can see it. It's typically placed in places that people can see it to send a message to a person. And on that note, what is the message? You know, what is this artist trying to say to someone? A lot of this is down to the level artist and level designer to consider the story of the space and judge whether or not the context makes sense for a logical placement. So we'll get into some examples here. So you can see here, this is The Last of Us. And I think this is overall a pretty clear example. You know, you have the big security wall, even just from the screenshot, we can see there's a big security wall, security checkpoint, sandbags down. This is a secure place. The artist was writing something presumably anti-security, and they wanted possibly the guards at the checkpoint or just onlookers to rally to their cause. So they wrote this piece of graffiti in this spot. And you can tell, even just not seeing the context of the gameplay, we know from this space that this seems like an appropriate place for this graffiti to be. Makes sense, right? Here's a bit of a weaker example. This is in GTA 5. So initially, just kind of low visibility, sort of off to the side. It's a lot of text, sure, but it is very far away from where the observer is probably seeing it. The location's a little questionable. You can see that there's sort of some highways extending overhead here. And it seems like the user's in a parking lot here. So whoever's going to see this is going to be parking their car. So it doesn't necessarily make sense, right? Unless the message is a little foggy. It seems like it's maybe anti-war, but this might make more sense if you put it next to an embassy or a military fort or someplace that the message is more relevant to the audience versus someone who is parking their car. Little bit shaky there. Another thing to keep in mind is that graffiti can be anywhere. Graffiti artists actually seek out hard to reach location for a number of reasons. For one, it shows off your skills and your metal. It's a point of pride to find a spot that few other people have reached, and that lets everybody see your work. And it's also more difficult for authorities to clear it. So if you put something really high up or in a really obscure, hard to reach place, you're actually going to have it there a lot longer than if you put it in a very commonly traveled area. So it's more money for your investment, for your time spent, I guess. There's a variety of methods used for this sort of thing, from rappelling from rooftops to impersonating authorities. You can see there's some artists here in this image, rappelling down from a monorail. What do you call that? Overhang? Yeah, overhang. Let's go with that. To get down from their target spot. So you can tell there's always a justification to use graffiti in a certain place. If you don't think that it makes sense for graffiti to be somewhere, you're completely wrong. And there's usually you can think of a justification for it to have gotten there in most cases. This is an example from Watch Dogs Legion. I really like this placement. It's good. Like it feels like a space that's impossible to reach. I could definitely see somebody be like, whoa, why is there graffiti up there? It makes no sense. But it shows that they put thought behind putting it up there, right? Because if it did actually make no sense, they wouldn't put it there. But here, you can see that the artist probably hung down from the top there and just sprayed on top of this. There's not really any access points from the ground, but yeah, there's definitely a path to which this could have been placed here, and since there's a path, it's totally believable that somebody took the time and effort to put it there, especially when you consider there's other pieces sort of nearby. So I think it totally works. It might seem illogical at first, but when you think about it, no, it's fine. This is a fun anecdote from my own game, bombing a graffiti sandbox. Originally, I only intended this bottom part of the wall to be paintable. I expected players to maybe climb the stairs and paint that, or like jump up here and paint this. But what I found is when a graffiti artist got his hands on the game, the first thing he did was climb up here and hop down on these ledges and then actually painted the whole wall, which caught me off guard. But it just goes to show, right? Graffiti finds a way. And if a graffiti artist wants to make their mark somewhere, they're going to figure out a way to do it. So as important to consider where graffiti is, it's also important to consider where graffiti isn't and why that is. Buffing is a term used when someone obscures a piece of graffiti. Graffiti artists usually have an interest in tagging near other artists or looking out for where other artists' work is able to remain. Typically, buffing is a deterrent for graffiti, but it doesn't prevent it outright. Buffing is also usually done by governments with paint or power washers, covering high traffic or well-funded areas first, and then just kind of wherever they have the bandwidth for. Important thing to note is that buffs rarely look good. People would rather have a wall painted in mismatched shades of old paint than a piece of graffiti on it. So signs that graffiti was on a wall are difficult to get out short of painting the whole wall. So typically you'll end up with sort of patches of a wall that look like they've been painted over in the past, because they have, because somebody has put graffiti up and then there's newer paint covering up where that graffiti was, even though it looks ugly. Buff walls are a really powerful visual storytelling tool, but many games don't actually include these, and that's a missed opportunity in my book. As an example here, another one from Watch Dogs Legion. So I really love this example. I think it's a great example of using buff walls effectively, because you can see sort of the layers of history behind this piece, right? So you can see that initially there was graffiti at the bottom. People have made graffiti here before. And then somebody came and just painted the whole wall, right? They were like buffing that wall. Looks like probably with mismatched paint a little bit, which kind of shows that they didn't really care. They just didn't want the graffiti to be there. And then on top of that, other people came along and put another layer of graffiti on top, saying like, no, hey, this is our wall. So you can see the conflict in this space, even without knowing anything about this world, even without the context of this being a very kind of political message. You can still totally tell that this is a contested area, right? There's a culture clash happening here. Also, another fun note, the garbage on the ground tells you that the government probably cared more about covering this graffiti up than keeping this area tidy. So in the same note, like here's an opportunity that could be acted on. So the tags here are a little unusually placed in my book, right? Because you can see there's a government drone there. There's sort of government branding here. There's a government vehicle here. You can tell this building is very government, right? They're probably using this for something. I don't know if it's an office or a base of operations, but it's in use by them actively. So it's interesting that they allow this graffiti to exist when you'd expect them to take that down right away because somebody has defaced their own office and they can't have that. So they'd want to cover that up, presumably as soon as possible. My assumption is that these were actually added by a level artist or a level designer in order to kind of indicate that there's a path here. You can tell that there's probably some kind of gameplay opportunity at the top. So they probably did this to kind of signal like, hey, go up here, look at this to the player. But I'd argue that buffed walls could do the exact same thing and kind of be more consistent in their usage with the message behind the government having a vested interest in this building, right? So if these walls, instead of having this graffiti exclusively, if they were buffed on top and they were very kind of awkward patches like we saw in the previous image of just paint, gray paint or beige paint or something to that effect, covering these areas up, you'd kind of be able to tell that, like somebody did put something here, but they didn't want anybody to see it. And you still kind of keep that player leading capacity when you have these really awkward colored sort of shaded walls against this brickwork. I think it could be just as effectively used if these were buffed, if not more, rather than just having the static graffiti here, because it shows that clash a little more effectively. Something else to keep in mind for graffiti placement is that the piece itself matters too. Most graffiti pieces in games aren't handmade for each location. The piece you choose to use in the location is just as important as the location itself. So basically, you don't want to use the wrong piece in the wrong place or in the wrong context. So you should ask yourself what medium makes the most sense for this placement. And you should kind of examine the piece and think about, is this piece sort of designed for how I want to use it? It's not always obvious, but through studying graffiti and looking at real world references, you'll kind of learn to look out for what makes sense contextually. This is a pretty strong example, right? You have larger pieces up here, kind of in conflict with one another, buffed areas on the ground. You can see that this is where people spend most of their time kind of tagging this wall, covering it in their bigger burner pieces. You have a tag up here, harder to reach area. Somebody probably got that out quick and was like, yeah, that's good. And then same up here, one burner, but like nothing super extensive because these areas are harder to reach. So naturally it would kind of flow upwards. The hierarchy at the bottom would be much larger than the top. So if you look at this whole setup, I think it looks kind of nice, right? Nothing seems out of place or sticks out as sort of being unreasonable. A little bit weaker of an example is this banner from Far Cry 6. So the banner's building size, right? It's very large. We can see that this is on the side of a factory or something. The line work here in Libertad, there's a lot of splatter and a lot of like dripping paint, so we can probably assume this was hand painted by someone, probably with a rag or something because it's on the big old banner. So hand painted with a rag on it. That's fine. But interesting note is like the gorilla emblem here is softer lines, which with kind of very aerosol looking, right? It looks like somebody spray painted this, which in itself isn't terrible, but the fact that it's this large scaled up on the side of a building and then compared next to the one that is like very aggressively like wet painted, we can tell that this probably wasn't made for this context, this emblem. It probably was made to be used in smaller locations on a smaller scale where it makes sense to be aerosoled, but then for this this asset, it must have been scaled up, right? So I don't know if it was the asset itself was scaled up, or maybe the like just the emblem was scaled up to fit this asset. I'm not really sure the full context for this, but you can kind of tell that like the usage here is a little bit mismatched for what the pieces themselves are. So this piece of emblem might not have been intended to be placed next to this Libertad logo. Just kind of like interesting stuff like that to keep an eye out for and kind of train your brain to think about as you're placing graffiti in the world. Another thing to consider is the history of graffiti. Just having graffiti in a spot like intrinsically gives that area a story, right? It tells you that someone went there and did something to the space. Some stuff you can ask yourself is like, how did the artist get here, right? So that can be a story in itself. It might even have player leading potential behind it. And what has happened since this piece was made? How has the environment affected the medium? Kind of in this image, you can see that moss has sort of started to grow over this graffiti. So nobody has put graffiti on this wall for a while. And, presumably moss has started to cover its place. This is no longer a popular wall. Maybe it's aged out. So here's a very excellent example from Left 4 Dead. I love this, not just because it's funny, even if we ignore the fact that it's pretty funny. It does a really effective job of telling you the story of this wall, of this surface. You can tell just from reading this text, we are the real monsters, big, bold at the top. But this person presumably wrote this first. They were one of the first people here. And then all these other people joined and kind of dogpiled on the we are the real monsters person. But like you can tell that through the story, right? I think it's really great. You can see how this wall was shaped over time due to external factors, and it kind of tells you the timeline of the place that you're in, right? You're not the first person here. You're not the second person here. There's probably been a dozen or more people here than before you. So I think this is a great piece in just showing how graffiti can kind of tell the history of a place or tell the story of how that graffiti got here. It's very interesting. A little bit more of a questionable example here. So an interesting thing to note for this piece is that if the piece looks clean like this, see, it's got very straight, clean lines. It looks like it's been painted by a paintbrush. And it makes sense for, I think, this is from Dishonored. So it makes sense for Dishonored because they don't really have aerosol or anything in their world. It's kind of a lower technology kind of world. So they probably don't have aerosol to just bring a can somewhere and spray paint a message to someone. But it also makes you consider, like, how did this artist get here? And like, what was their motivation, right? Because if you're hand painting this, I mean, power to them. It's just a lot to paint, you know. You have to. It's a very intricate message you're trying to send with a bucket of paint and a paintbrush. And depending on where this is located, that could be a real pain in the butt. Hauling a bucket of paint and bringing your paintbrush over to wherever this is located just to paint it on this piece of metal that presumably could just get thrown away by someone if they didn't like it. So it kind of, when you consider the story of the artist getting there and the location, it kind of makes you sort of question the history of this locale and makes you realize that it might not be an effective usage. So from that, I'm going to take you through some considerations for rendering graffiti. So this is more specific to how your graffiti should look, but I think it's equally important for all disciplines to take this into account because it really does kind of tie into everything else we've been talking about. So drips. Drips are pretty straightforward. It's what happens when someone applies too much paint to a surface and causes it to drip down the wall. You can see the drips here. You can see a little bit of dripping there. In aerosol, they're usually an indicator that an artist isn't skilled with the medium. It's a sign that they've overestimated how close the can is to the surface, or they have too much overspray on a particular area. Sometimes they're used with intentionality by more experienced artists, so it's important to know the difference there. We can see on the left, this artist is probably more experienced because you can tell they were using a mop marker and just kind of pushed it as hard as they could in some areas to kind of really get that, really sell that drip throughout the piece. Whereas over here, you can tell, aside from the lettering being sort of wonky, I guess, some of the line work that's really close has a lot of drip because they held the can too close, and the drips came. Part of me looking at this imagines that they might have been drunk or something when they wrote that because it's very wobbly, very shaky. So drips will also typically follow gravity and angle only when the texture of the surface changes in direction. Kind of like here, you can see the drip kind of falls down and then drips off to the side as the surface itself has its own like inconsistencies. It kind of guides where the drip goes. They seem pretty straightforward, but they can be deceptively easy to mess up, especially in virtual spaces where we don't have laws of physics to necessarily guide our hand. As an example of that, here's Tomb Raider 2013. So what's wrong with this initially? It might not be immediately apparent, but so you can see that this arrow goes down an angle, this one goes up at an angle, but these drips, they kind of drip off into the side. They don't follow the flow of the grain of the wood that they're on. They drip away, they kind of point in different directions. This is also an example of why considering the piece you're using is important, because obviously considering the drips into account, and an artist probably made this arrow with the intention of it pointing to the right, probably for usage in maybe a different part of the level, and then somebody saw this and reused it in this space. So now the drips don't make any sense, especially because they're angled and the scale is flipped on one of them. So now the drips drip off one way, they drip up the other way. They no longer just drip downwards as the arrow points to the right. They just kind of drip wherever. So it doesn't really work, and I think somebody failed to take that into account as they kind of made this setup. So that's why drips can kind of betray the intention of your piece. Here's another example of drips kind of betraying the intention a little bit. So the letters have drip, that's good, but the drips are almost perfect, very consistent with the same thickness and consistency as the lettering itself. So you can see the C is kind of like a thicker kind of chisel brush, and then these are also kind of chiseled as well on top of that. And same with down here too. You can see that it carries on a bit, but it's kind of in a chisel-y, similar to the line work of the actual piece. So it tells me that a graphic designer made this, of course, because even if this was hand painted with a paintbrush, it's a strange aesthetic choice, I guess, for somebody who's trying to send this message that this place isn't good, for them to also kind of take the care and time to make little chisel drips on their piece. And it does kind of muddy the water and makes it difficult to tell if they were made intentionally. It could be intentional by the in-game artist, or it could be an oversight. It's hard to read, and I think that kind of weakens its use on the whole. That's from Deus Ex also. I don't know if I mentioned that. Fonts are another good consideration. A lot of the time the temptation is to use fonts because they're easier or more accessible. You can just kind of type something out and you're good. But in graffiti, fonts are usually best avoided for handmade mediums like tags or aerosol lettering. They only really make sense for use in stencils, wheat pasting, or slaps because they're not made on the spot. They're pre-made, so you can definitely use a font to pre-make something and then apply it in the world. However, aerosol, painting, tags, a lot of that stuff is made on the spot in the public forum, so it's a little less conductive to use a font for something like that. Another example here from Dishonored, you can tell that either this was hand painted on the spot and the artist very intricately painted out all these letters in a very nice font, or it was just kind of like put in there by the artist. So ineffective font use, just because once again, it kind of muddies the line. Like there is the possibility that this was a stencil someone cut out and then brought this here and then painted over it, but that kind of gives me even more questions, honestly. This would take some serious work if somebody just painted this out. And I think I would argue that this would be better handwritten in just like very ugly kind of paint font, similar to the previous Dishonored example, than using a pre-made font to make this feel more authentic to its creation. Flares. So, warning, flares are my favorite tool for analyzing graffiti and critiquing it. Flares occur in aerosol when an artist's can isn't aligned with the surface that they're painting on. They can tell you a lot of hidden information about the artist behind the piece and sort of the story behind it too. So for example here, you notice in the bottom right image how all the tags at the top of this wall sort of flare and point upwards. So kind of up here you can see it's sort of faded away a little bit. As the lines move further up, they start to fade more and more. It's pretty consistent, right? That actually means that the artists who were painting on this wall were painting from below, so they were shorter and probably having to reach up at an angle and point their cans upwards for the additional height. People who are less experienced with aerosol tend to flare more frequently, at least on like an even normal surface, no height differences. They'll tend to flare just from inexperience with lack of can control. Flares also show you the direction an artist was writing the letters in. So if you flare a letter out, such as, let's see, where's the example for this one? So if you flare a letter out, let's just take like this. So typically when you're finishing up a line, you'll kind of let go of the gas, as it will, and like pull away, and you'll show little flares from that experience at the end of your line. As in the bottom left, flares are also occasionally used intentionally by experienced artists, so that's another consideration to keep in mind too. And flares, I find personally, are what expose a lot of video game aerosol as being digital or being artificial. And I'll show you a bit of what I mean, because they can be tricky, but they're a lot of fun to look at. So here's an opportunity to improve use of flares. So first of all, though, this is from Far Cry 6. The lettering is very good and definitely passes like a sniff test for graffiti. I looked at it for quite a while because I always stare at this stuff for longer than I should, and I looked at it for a while and I was like, no, that looks good. You can see everything is kind of different. The O's look a little bit different. The exclamation points are different. They don't just look flipped. The N kind of flares upwards appropriately, showing that person was lifting the can. But notice in the word Viva, the V's flare out into the right. So the artist started on the left, brought their can down, brought it up again, and then flared off to the right. And that's okay. That's good. That's a nice detail, and it's consistent between these two V's. But then when you look at the V in Revolucion, it goes the other way, right? Which is unusual because it means, so this probably means the artist was writing from right or from left to right, as you'd expect in this language. But for some reason, this V, they decided to start from the opposite direction. And it's slightly possible, but it's also inconsistent with the way that the rest of their lettering was portrayed. It implies that they wrote it backwards than how they're normally inclined to. It makes it just feel a little bit more suspicious almost. So kind of one of those tricks with flares to keep an eye on, because that's the sort of thing where if you don't nail that flaring right, you can kind of see through it a little bit. Kind of breaks that immersion a little. Overall, though, the piece is strong. The flares generally point where they should, and I really like kind of the more wobbly line work that sort of shows you that this person maybe wasn't an expert. They were just sending a message. And for the final note here, textures. Textures to me are the thing that sells the feel of graffiti the most. It doesn't only show the piece, but it also shows the surface itself and its history. Typically, lighter colors will allow more of the wall to show through, while darker colors will obscure the color beneath a little bit more. so you won't see as much of the texture underneath. So you can see here, you have a lot of cracks and like a lot of brickwork visible underneath these whites and these blues as well. You can see it compared with the brick itself. And then the blacks, you really almost don't get any of that. And that's pretty consistent with how real graffiti should look on a wall. These are from Hitman 3. And also this detail, fire hose, nice. You see some fire hose with coverage there. That's beautiful. So as you can tell, Hitman 3. Hitman 3 is a pretty strong example of good graffiti in games. The Berlin level features it pretty prominently, and I have like next to no complaints about it. It's so beautiful. The paint surfaces have a lot of detail. There's a lot of you can see a lot of different details through the paint's textures. So you can see the wall studs, you can see the like lining of the wall there. You've got some water damage kind of built up in areas. You've got some paint buildup sort of on the bottom. You've got some cracks going through. There's so much like happening in the textures of these walls that really sells the idea that this graffiti isn't just sitting on top of the wall or like hovering near it. It's in the wall itself. It's on the wall as it should be. And it really makes these pieces feel like they're a part of the wall, which is also really key for rendering graffiti. And then here's sort of a weaker example from Fallout New Vegas. This example sort of breaks my heart. So the wall texture is really beautiful. Like it's a nice kind of layered sort of brick there. But the graffiti on top is just completely opaque. Even though it's a lower resolution, I don't have any complaints about that. But the fact that you can't see any of the texture underneath, when this is done in a white as well. So the white should really kind of betray the textures beneath it and let you kind of see it through, but it just obscures it all, and it really just makes it feel like it kind of sits in between you and the wall. It doesn't sit on the wall itself. It's definitely something that was probably, I think, placed just hovering slightly at 0.01 X value on top of the wall versus on the wall. There's a lot of missed potential with this one. So to sum up what we've discussed, virtual worlds benefit from graffiti, and it helps environmental storytelling and immersion. And it's kind of on anybody who's involved in the graffiti placement process or the graffiti touching process. It doesn't hurt to care about graffiti or its message. Graffiti and street art is an important distinction and is a good one to keep in mind. Street art being sanctioned public works and graffiti being unsanctioned works. And graffiti is also very diverse and very wide. Everything you saw here is not to sum up or monolith graffiti. There's a lot more to it than what I've presented. And some of the principles that we've covered, when you place it, consider the context, the world around it, the location, the piece itself, how it's rendered, what its intention was with its creation and where it should go, the history of the wall and the space and how that might affect the development or adaptation of the graffiti for it. Remember that graffiti has a very wide reach and can be basically anywhere you want it to be. But also remember that some places will get buffed and that the government or the people who are maintaining areas typically don't want graffiti, and it's something to keep in mind. For rendering, remember those drips and how they'll inform the placement. Keep in mind, only use fonts when it makes sense to do so. For stenciling, we paste anything pre-made, but not anything made on the spot. For flares, keep an eye on flares. Study from references and make sure you kind of understand how flares play into the pieces that you're creating. And for textures, make sure the textures come through the wall. And there's nothing more beautiful than a very, very detailed wall that just lets you see all those details through the piece. Do that and keep these in mind, and you'll be good to go whenever you put graffiti in your games. And thank you very much for listening. I appreciate everybody watching this video. This is the question and answer slide, but you are more than welcome to leave a comment and I'll get around to it, but I can't answer your questions right now because this is a video and not a live presentation. Yeah, thanks very much for watching and have a good day. Bye.